The library had always been Malia's refuge, a place where the world softened long enough for her to breathe. But tonight, the calm cracked open when she found the letter about the possible closure. Tucked between returned books. It's between returned books. Bold red stamp blurring as her eyes stung. She whispered a quiet no to herself, trying to steady her trembling hands, unaware that someone had stepped into the dim aisle and caught the moment she almost broke. Adrian paused at the end of the row, unsure why the sight of a stranger in pain tugged so sharply at him. Yet something in the way she tried to hide her hurt pulled him forward. For a breath, neither spoke. Only dusk light stretched across the worn carpet, settling like a held question between them. When their eyes met, it felt like recognition of something they had not yet lived. And even though they both looked away, the pull remained, quiet but undeniable, leaving the air thick with what neither understood. Sometimes the first spark isn't loud. It's the hush before everything changes, the kind that makes you wonder who you could become if someone finally saw you. Malia tried to return to her routine, sliding books onto shelves with the steady rhythm she relied on to quiet her thoughts. Yet the echo of that shared glance lingered like a whisper she couldn't brush away. She felt the familiar comfort of the library pressing in around her, but underneath it was a trembling unease, the kind that settles into the corners of a room when something important has shifted. Adrian hovered near the entrance, pretending to read a plaque on the wall, though she could sense his presence without looking. The silence between them stretched, not cold but curious, as if waiting for someone to speak first. She wondered why a stranger's eyes had felt so gentle, why for a moment she hadn't felt invisible. When she finally stepped toward the next aisle, she exhaled slowly, trying to calm the swirl inside her, unaware that he, too, was gathering courage, wondering how to approach without breaking whatever fragile thread now connected them. Adrian drifted toward the reading tables, telling himself he was just exploring the space. Yet every few steps he found his gaze drifting back to where she moved between shelves. Something about the calm way she carried herself made him slow down, as though the constant urgency he lived with had no place here. He brushed his fingertips over the old wooden tabletop, feeling the grooves carved by decades of readers, and wondered how this quiet place had become the most grounding moment of his week. He didn't know what he would say if she looked his way again, only that he felt strangely at ease near her, a feeling he hadn't earned but didn't want to lose. As he stood beneath the soft circle of lamplight, he realized he wasn't searching for words, he was searching for courage. Malia paused at the circulation desk to organize a stack of newly returned novels, hoping the familiar task would still her racing thoughts. She traced a finger along the spine of a favorite title, grounding herself in its worn texture, but the memory of the moment in the aisle kept rising like a tide she couldn't push back. She caught a glimpse of Adrian across the room and quickly looked down, unsure why her heartbeat skipped at the sight. It felt reckless to react this way to someone she didn't know, yet something about his presence softened the sharp edges of the day. She allowed herself a slow breath as the hum of the library wrapped around her, reminding her she wasn't alone, even if she often felt that way. Maybe, she thought, some moments arrive not to overwhelm, but to wake something quiet inside you. Adrian finally gathered enough resolve to approach the front desk, though each step felt heavier than it should. He wasn't sure what he intended to say, only that walking away without trying would leave him wondering for far too long. Malia looked up just as he reached the counter, her expression startled yet open, and the air between them shifted again, warm and tentative. For a moment, neither spoke. The library hum softened around them as if giving them space to find the right beginning. He noticed the steadiness in her eyes, the kind that made the world feel quieter. And she noticed the tired gentleness in his, uncommon in someone who carried himself with such composed strength. The pause stretched into something meaningful, a small doorway neither had expected but both felt drawn toward, leaving the moment hanging with quiet promise. The morning after their quiet encounter, Malia moved through the library with a strange new awareness, as though the air carried echoes of a moment she still didn't know how to name. She tried to focus on preparing the community room for the children's reading hour, but her thoughts kept drifting toward the possibility that Adrian might return. She told herself it didn't matter, that a stranger's kindness shouldn't linger the way it did. Yet her heartbeat disagreed every time she replayed the softness she'd seen in his eyes. Across town, Adrian found himself driving without intention, ending up near the library before he realized he'd followed an instinct rather than a plan. He wasn't used to letting impulse lead him, but something about Malia's quiet strength called him back. When he stepped inside and saw her arranging small chairs in gentle rows, the rush of calm that swept through him felt like reason enough to stay. Malia felt him before she heard him, a quiet shift in the room's rhythm, and when she rose to her feet, their eyes met with the same gentle pull that had unsettled her the night before. She offered a polite smile, trying to mask the flutter she felt, and he returned it with a warmth that made her steady herself. Adrian asked if the library always felt this peaceful in the morning, and she nodded, surprised at how easy his voice sounded in the space. Their conversation flowed in soft, cautious threads, about books, about quiet, about how rare it was to feel still in a busy world. Malia sensed something complicated behind his calm exterior, something tired yet searching, and she wondered why she wanted to understand him. The moment felt simple, but not small. It felt like the first real step toward something neither of them had expected. Later that afternoon, Malia found herself shelving books in the history section, trying to sort through the emotions stirred up by Adrian's return. She wasn't used to someone noticing her so attentively, and the thought left her both warm and cautious. Adrian wandered the aisles with a curiosity that wasn't forced, stopping occasionally to read the plaques describing the library's founding. He asked her thoughtful questions about the building's age and the community events held there, and she was surprised by how deeply he seemed to care. She didn't know that each detail he learned tightened a quiet knot in his chest, because he already suspected his company's expansion plans were connected to this very block. For now, he kept that fear tucked away, choosing instead to listen to the gentle steadiness in her voice as she spoke about the library she loved. As the day faded, Malia moved to the front desk to prepare closing procedures, expecting the usual solitude that came with the evening shift. Instead, Adrian lingered nearby, browsing the display table with a hesitation that felt more like hope than uncertainty. He asked about her favorite books, and she answered shyly at first, then with growing openness as he listened without interruption. She felt herself relaxing in a way she hadn't realized she needed, her thoughts settling like pages turning at a steady rhythm. Adrian found himself smiling more easily than he had in months, the simple sound of her voice easing tensions he rarely spoke of. Their exchange wasn't dramatic or rushed. It unfolded gently, like two people rediscovering the art of being seen. When silence settled between them, it felt like comfort rather than distance. As closing time neared, Adrian walked with Malia toward the entrance, both moving slowly, as if neither wanted the day to end. She thanked him for keeping her company, her voice carrying a softness that made him pause before answering. He admitted he hadn't planned to stay as long as he did, but somehow felt lighter here than anywhere else. The honesty in his words made something warm bloom in her chest, though she hid it behind a modest smile. Outside, dust gathered over the street, washing the brick buildings in muted purples and golds. They shared a brief, lingering moment at the door, one that didn't ask for anything but promised almost everything. When he finally stepped back into the fading light, both of them knew they would see each other again soon, even if neither dared to say it aloud. The week moved slowly, but the space between Malia and Adrian kept tightening in small, unspoken ways. Each time he returned to the library, their conversations grew a little deeper, slipping past surface-level questions into tender places neither had meant to reveal. Malia found herself looking forward to his quiet presence, the way his voice eased into the room like a warm breeze after rain. Adrian tried to ignore the tightening in his chest whenever she smiled, telling himself he couldn't afford feelings when his life was tangled in responsibilities she knew nothing about. Yet with every shared moment, the weight he carried felt lighter, as if her calm steadiness chipped at the walls he'd built to protect what he thought was left of himself. Neither spoke of it directly, but something unspoken was forming, slowly, carefully, like trust learning how to breathe. As they studied the old maps, Adrian asked questions that revealed more about his mind than the materials themselves, thoughtful inquiries that made Malia pause before answering. She noticed the way he listened, not just to her words, but to her pauses, as if he understood the things she didn't say out loud. When she spoke about the library's history and the people it had served, he watched her with a softness that made her breath catch. She felt herself opening a little more, her voice warming as she described the community events her mother once organized here. Adrian's gaze softened further, struck by the quiet depth of a woman who cherished what others might overlook. The connection between them grew richer, layered with sincerity and the ache of two lives that hadn't been treated gently, but still managed to reach for light. Later, while Malia returned books to the archives room, Adrian wandered to the administrative board near the entrance, scanning the announcements and community papers pinned there. His gaze froze when he found a folded notice tucked beneath a flyer, an early outline of the redevelopment proposals targeting their block. His company's logo sat quietly in the corner, a familiar emblem suddenly drowning him in guilt. He stepped back, breath tightening, realizing the awful truth. The place that made him feel alive again was the same one his investors wanted to erase. Panic pulsed beneath his ribs as he imagined Malia's reaction if she discovered his connection to the threat. He closed his eyes briefly, torn between honesty and the fear of losing the fragile trust that had begun to build. Keeping the truth felt wrong, but telling it felt impossible. Malia soon noticed the shift in Adrian's expression when he rejoined her, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there earlier. She asked if he was all right, her voice gentle but concerned, and he offered a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She sensed a heaviness he wasn't ready to share, and though part of her wanted to push, she knew too well how fragile someone's silence could be. Instead, she told him about a poetry event the library planned to revive, remembering how her mother once ran it with so much joy. Her voice softened as she spoke, and something in his demeanor eased, as if her memories were a balm he hadn't expected. For a few minutes, the tension between them melted into warmth again, though an unspoken worry lingered beneath his calm replies. Before leaving that evening, Adrian paused near the doorway, torn between the truth pressed against his conscience and the fear of breaking whatever this budding closeness had become. Malia approached with a warm but curious look, sensing the storm he kept tucked behind his steady demeanor. He wanted to tell her everything, about the redevelopment plans, about the role he played, about why he had come here in the first place, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he thanked her for the day, his voice quieter than usual, as if weighed down by something he couldn't put down yet. She watched him go, feeling an ache she couldn't explain, a whisper telling her that something unsaid was growing between them. The door closed softly behind him, leaving her alone with the fading warmth of his presence, and a worry she wasn't ready to name. The tension that Adrian had been quietly carrying finally began to show in the small spaces between his words. When he arrived at the library that morning, his smile was gentler but heavier, as if he'd spent the night wrestling with a truth he didn't know how to set free. Malia greeted him with her usual calm warmth, yet she felt something different in the air, an uneasiness that clung to him like a shadow. As they walked through the aisles together, she noticed how distracted he seemed, how his eyes lingered, not on her but on the walls, shelves, and windows, as though memorizing things he feared might disappear. She asked him if everything was all right, and in the fragile pause that followed, a quiet fear flickered through her heart. She didn't know what he was hiding, but she felt the shape of it pressing into the moment, growing heavier with every breath. And for the first time, the gentle comfort between them felt as if it stood on ground beginning to crack. Maia finally found the courage to ask him directly what was wrong, her voice soft but steady, as they stood near a small table of newly donated books. Adrian hesitated, his gaze drifting downward. As he searched for words, he still wasn't ready to speak. She watched the struggle ripple across his features and felt her chest tighten with the fear that whatever he was holding back had something to do with her world. When he finally murmured that he'd been dealing with pressure from work, the explanation felt thin, like a half-truth wrapped in apology. She nodded slowly, unsure whether to press further, but the ache in his voice settled into her heart like a warning. In the quiet that followed, they both reached for the same book by accident, their hands brushing for a brief, charged second before he gently pulled away. Something between them shifted in that tiny moment. Something fragile, something fearful, something she didn't yet understand. Later that afternoon, while helping a student find research materials, Mania overheard two residents discussing the redevelopment plans rumored to affect the block. Her breath faltered as she listened, the words striking her like cold rain. She stepped closer, asking to see the flyer they held, and the moment her eyes landed on the logo in the corner, her heart dropped. Adrian's company. Her mind raced through every moment they'd shared, every gentle glance, every soft conversation. And suddenly, the warmth between them felt like a betrayal blooming in her chest. She tried to steady her breathing, but the ground beneath her seemed to tilt as realization sunk deeper. When Adrian reappeared at the end of the aisle with a hopeful smile, she felt something inside her pull back sharply, instinctively guarding the parts of herself she had slowly begun to open. She didn't confront him then, but her silence grew thick with hurt. Merc called. Oh, when she finally confronted him, her voice cracked in a way she couldn't control. She asked why he hadn't told her the truth, why he let her speak about the library's history and her mother's memories without saying his company planned to erase the place that held them all. Adrian stood frozen, guilt written plainly across his face as he tried to explain that he hadn't known at first, and then didn't know how to tell her once he did. But the explanations came too late. Each word tumbled into the widening space between them, sounding smaller and smaller against the loud ache inside her chest. She stepped back, crossing her arms defensively, fighting the sting of betrayal swelling behind her eyes. Adrian reached out instinctively, but she turned away, her silence harder than anger. In that moment, the gentle bond they had been nurturing felt painfully fragile, as if a single breath could shatter it. Adrian left the library that evening with a heaviness he hadn't felt in years. Malia watched him go, but didn't call after him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she tried to steady the shaking in her chest. The library felt unbearably quiet now, its familiar comfort unable to soften the hurt twisting inside her. She sank into one of the reading chairs, staring at the faded carpet, as the truth settled like a weight across her heart. She couldn't understand why the loss felt so sharp when they had barely begun anything real. Maybe it was because she had allowed herself to hope, something she hadn't done in a long time. Outside, the sky dimmed into blue, and for a moment she closed her eyes, trying to gather herself. But the echo of his silence lingered in her mind, leaving her unsure of whether she could forgive him or whether she even wanted to. The days after their painful confrontation stretched heavy between them, each one settling like dust on shelves that had once felt warm and alive. Mania moved through the library with practiced calm, but inside, her heart felt raw, bruised by disappointment. She wished she didn't feel so deeply. She tried to convince herself that the hurt was temporary, that she barely knew Adrian, but her chest tightened each time she passed the aisles they once wandered together. Adrian, on the other hand, spent nights studying contracts and board proposals with a growing sense of urgency, determined to find a way to reverse the damage he hadn't meant to cause. He knew he'd lost her trust, maybe even her openness, but the thought of the library fading into rubble because of his silence felt unbearable. As he stepped into the building again, determined to speak, Malia felt her breath catch, not with warmth this time, but with the fear of reopening a wound she had barely managed to close. Adrian approached with hesitant steps, offering a quiet greeting that wavered with remorse. Millionaire returned it with a polite nod, her voice steady, but her eyes avoiding his. He asked if they could talk, his tone low and earnest, and she reluctantly agreed, though her heart thudded with uncertainty. They walked toward a quieter corner of the library where the hum of distant pages softened the air. Adrian spoke first, apologizing not just for hiding the truth, but for letting fear dictate his silence. Molia listened, torn between compassion and self-protection. She admitted that the betrayal hurt not because of the redevelopment plans alone, but because she had allowed herself to trust him, something she rarely did. His shoulders sagged at her honesty, yet hope flickered in his eyes. For the first time since their falling out, the air between them shifted, no longer sharp with anger but softened by the fragile beginnings of understanding. After hearing her truth, Adrian told her about the proposal he'd drafted, one that would protect the library by designating it as a community cultural landmark, shielding it from demolition. Mayla blinked in surprise, unable to hide the flicker of hope that crossed her face. He explained it wasn't approved yet, and that he was risking backlash from investors, but he couldn't stand by and watch something so meaningful be erased. She felt warmth pressing against her guarded walls, and for the first time since their fracture, her chest loosened. Malia thanked him quietly, touched not by the grand gesture alone but by the sincerity in his voice. Though she wasn't ready to fall back into what they had, she allowed herself to see a man behind the mistake, the one who cared enough to fight. Something gentle stirred between them again, like the first soft breath after a storm. As they continued talking, the heaviness between them shifted into something calmer, though still delicate. Malia admitted that the library meant more to her than just a workplace. It was the last piece of her mother she still felt connected to. Adrian listened closely, his gaze softening with every detail she shared. He apologized again, this time not as a man trying to fix something, but as someone genuinely grieving the hurt he'd caused. She felt the sincerity in his words, the quiet tremble in his voice that revealed just how deeply he understood the weight of loss. Though the ache of betrayal hadn't vanished, it began to mingle with something gentler, something that reminded her how rare it was for someone to fight for the things she loved. The moment didn't promise healing all at once, but it opened a doorway she didn't feel the need to close. As the evening approached, the library began to empty, leaving a warm hush settling through the aisles. Malia and Adrian walked together toward the front, steps slow, neither wanting to rush whatever was unfolding between them. At the entrance, she paused, looking up at him with an expression no longer guarded but not fully open either. Something in between, something honest. Adrian promised he would continue fighting for the library, even if it cost him more than he expected. She thanked him again, her voice gentle, touched with something almost like trust. Before he turned to leave, their eyes lingered on each other, and the moment held the softness of a beginning rather than the weight of an ending. When he stepped outside into the cool dusk, Malia exhaled, feeling a quiet warmth settling into her chest, a fragile but promising spark of forgiveness. The next week brought a quiet shift. Neither of them tried to rush. Adrian visited the library, not with hesitation this time, but with purpose, carrying updates on the preservation proposal, and a determination that softened the air around him. Malia greeted him with a gentler expression than before, a sign that the wall between them had begun to thin. They spent hours reviewing documents, sharing ideas, and slowly stitching trust back together, piece by piece. With each exchanged glance, Malia felt the old ache loosen, replaced by a cautious warmth she hadn't expected to return. Adrian found himself breathing easier around her, as though the simple act of standing beside her reminded him of who he wanted to be. The work was tiring, the stakes heavy, but the sense of partnership between them made every moment feel meaningful. And for the first time in weeks, it felt like they were moving toward something steady, instead of breaking apart. Their collaboration soon became the highlight of Malia's days, filling the library with a sense of motion and purpose that lifted her spirits. Adrian asked her opinion on everything, from community needs to architectural details, and she found herself surprised by how valued her voice felt. He listened with the kind of attention that made her feel seen in ways she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. As they worked, small moments of comfort unfolded naturally. His quiet laugh when she teased him about his overly neat notes, her soft smile when he held a door open without thinking. Each moment felt gentle, unforced, like something growing at its own steady pace. And though neither mentioned it aloud, the air between them began warming again, carrying the promise of something deeper stirring in the quiet. One afternoon, while reviewing the final details of the landmark application, Malia paused, realizing how far they'd come since the painful silence that once stood between them. Adrian noticed the shift in her expression and asked if she was all right. She admitted quietly that she was grateful for his effort, for his honesty, and for the way he had shown up, even when it was difficult. Adrian's eyes softened, something unguarded flickering across them. And for a moment, neither of them looked away. The space felt fragile, tender, filled with an unspoken truth neither dared to touch too quickly. Still, the moment settled warmly between them, a sign that the hard edges of the past were slowly smoothing into something gentler. It wasn't a declaration, but it was something real, something both of them felt down to the quietest part of their hearts. As evening approached, they reviewed the final draft together, their shoulders nearly touching as they leaned over the table. Malia found herself studying the details of his handwriting, the precision of his notes, and wondered how someone who carried so much weight could still offer such gentleness. Adrian, in turn, noticed the quiet strength she carried in her posture, the calm focus in her eyes, and felt something settle inside him, an understanding of why this place and this woman mattered more than any deal or title. When their hands brushed while reaching for the same pen, neither pulled away quickly. The touch lingered just long enough for both of them to feel the spark beneath it, a reminder that healing could be soft, slow, and incredibly real. The moment left them both quietly breathless. By the time they finalized the proposal, night had wrapped itself around the library, leaving the quiet space glowing like a sanctuary. Malia walked Adrian to the entrance again, but this time the air felt different. Not heavy or uncertain, but warm with a quiet hope that neither tried to hide. He thanked her for trusting him again, his voice steady but touched with emotion. She met his gaze, letting him see the honesty in her eyes as she told him that trust wasn't about perfection, but effort. And he had shown more effort than she expected. Their eyes lingered in a soft, gentle pause that stretched like a promise. When Adrian stepped outside into the calm night air, Malia remained at the doorway for a few moments longer, holding onto the warmth he left behind. And for the first time since everything fell apart, she let herself believe that some broken things could return stronger than before. Morning sunlight poured through the library windows with a warmth that felt almost symbolic, as though the building itself sensed that something long awaited was finally unfolding. Malia arrived early, her heart quietly racing as she prepared the front room for the meeting that would determine the library's future. Adrian walked in moments later carrying the finalized proposal, his expression a mix of hope and nerves. They exchanged a soft greeting that held more emotion than words could carry. As they arranged chairs and gathered documents, their steps fell into an easy rhythm, one that reminded Malia how naturally they fit beside each other. Adrian kept glancing toward her with quiet gratitude, and each time she caught his gaze, she felt the warmth in her chest deepen. The moment didn't need grand gestures or declarations. It simply needed them, standing together, fighting for something that mattered to them both. Community members filled the room with a hum of anticipation, their voices weaving into a backdrop that made the moment feel monumental. Malia stood beside Adrian as he presented the proposal, her presence steady and reassuring. She watched him speak with a quiet passion she hadn't seen before, his words carrying both strength and sincerity. The crowd listened closely, moved by the depth of his commitment to preserving the library. When it was her turn, Malia stepped forward and spoke softly but confidently about what the library meant to the neighborhood, to her mother, and to every child who had found comfort in its quiet corners. Adrian glanced at her with admiration, the kind that warmed her from the inside out. The room fell still as her final words settled over the audience, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt possible. When the committee announced their decision, the room erupted with relieved cheers that echoed off the high ceilings. The library would be preserved, protected as a landmark for generations to come. Malia felt her breath hitch, a wave of joy rushing through her so quickly she had to steady herself. Adrian let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh before turning to her, with a smile that softened every line of his face. Without thinking, she stepped into his arms, and he held her as though the moment carried every emotion they'd fought to reach. Their embrace wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was warm, grateful, and full of the quiet understanding they had earned together. When they finally stepped apart, their eyes held the soft spark of something new, something bright and full of promise, no longer weighed down by uncertainty or fear. Later that evening, after the excitement settled, Adrian and Malia walked through the now quiet aisles, their steps gentle against the familiar carpet. The library felt different somehow, lighter, safer, like a place reborn. Malia traced her fingers along the spines of books her mother once shelved, feeling the past and present settle together peacefully. Adrian watched her with a calm tenderness, sensing the depth of what the victory meant to her. When she turned toward him, he stepped closer, not hesitating this time. He told her softly that she had changed him, that her patience, her honesty, and her strength had made him want to live differently. The sincerity in his voice wrapped around her like warmth, and for the first time she didn't fight the feeling rising inside her. She simply let it be. They stopped near the front doors, the same spot where forgiveness first began to bloom. The city lights shimmered outside, casting gentle reflections across the glass. Adrian reached for her hand, his voice quiet but unwavering as he told her he didn't just want to save the library. He wanted to build a life where she felt seen, supported, and free to dream. Malia felt her breath catch, not in fear, but in recognition of something she had longed for without naming. She stepped closer, letting her forehead rest gently against his, their shared silence carrying the weight of every tender moment that brought them here. When she whispered that she saw a future with him too, his smile unfolded slowly, full of warmth and promise. Outside, the night hummed softly, holding their beginning with gentle care.